Since a lot of the funds in the healthcare system are flowing through intermediaries, most of the money that gets from patients to providers goes through the intermediaries. If physicians want to care for patients and get paid for their services, they need relationships with the intermediaries. We need to talk about some elements of those relationships. When we're thinking about privately run physician practices, in the most basic sense, what we're talking about are arrangements or agreements between the practices and the intermediaries that specify some structure that provides for enrollees to get care from the practice and provides some structure for payment when the patients see doctors in the practice. Sometimes this is relatively straightforward. Some intermediaries will accept many or all practices that are interested. They may just state some payment arrangements that are available. And practices that are okay accepting those arrangements and want to make themselves available to care for the intermediaries' members, they can become affiliated. Maybe in this case, they just have to sign up, send some required information perhaps, keep it current over time, and they're good to go. Often, though, it's more complicated. In the US, for example, nearly all private insurers set up physician networks in a more negotiated and deliberate fashion. By a network here, I mean a particular set of physicians or practices with whom the insurer works, and which the members covered by the insurer will be encouraged to, or they may have to, see if the insurer is going to cover the cost of the member's care. In this case, practices and insurers have to mutually arrange for the practice to be part of that network. In order to do that, the intermediary and the physicians would commonly negotiate to see if they can work something out. The intermediary will be seeking to put in place arrangements with a suitable set of physicians to care for their members. They need some doctors for their network. And the practices will be seeking to get patients, so they have some business, something to do. And both of them will be looking for terms of an agreement that they like. If a payer and a practice agree on an arrangement, then we'll say the physicians in the practice will be part of the network or in network for the payer, and the people covered by the payer will be able to see the physicians and have the payer cover or contribute to the cost of their care. For example, an insurance company, let's make up a fictitious insurance company, Blue Ribbon Insurance. They'll go out and look for practices for their network. And some practices may be interested in talking, particularly if Blue Ribbon has lots of enrollees. They can get together and talk. How many patients would Blue Ribbon expect to send to the practice? What are Blue Ribbon's rules or expectations about how the practice would manage those patients that might be an issue? And how much would the practice get paid? They negotiate over all that. Once the deals are made, then there's a network. Blue Ribbon encourages, maybe requires, its enrollees to go to doctors in the network, and the practices benefit because they can get business from the Blue Ribbon patients. As an aside, you might ask, what about physicians who don't end up in the network with a particular insurer? Well, we'll say those doctors are out of network for that plan, and enrollees in the plan would not be able to use them, or at least not as easily. That's got its own set of issues, and maybe we'll find another time to talk about what happens then. The size and structure of practices is associated with how this works. For larger groups, they probably have some management structure, some people in the organization that can make these arrangements. They might go out and make an agreement with an insurer for all the physicians in their group who could then become in-network physicians, and they make payment arrangements for the group then. Things get a little more complicated as practices get smaller. Small practices can, of course, set up arrangements on their own if they like. They can go make a direct arrangement with a payer. But dealing with many small practices can be time-consuming for insurers, and it's also difficult for smaller practices with less management overhead. Smaller practices might also feel disadvantaged in the negotiations. Small practice talking to a big insurer. As a result, one of the things that's happened is that organizations have come along and tried to help with this. It's a new type of organization to introduce into our picture of the healthcare system. We'll generically call these network organizers. Perhaps the most commonly recognized type in the US is what's referred to as an IPA, an Independent Practice Association. How does this work? What is this? Well, think about the IPA as setting itself up as a business and then going around talking to practices, often smaller practices out in the community, making arrangements with them in which they can join the IPA, participate as a member of the IPA, if you will, under some terms that provide for the physicians to see patients who end up associated with the IPA and be paid by the IPA when that happens. In a way, what they're doing is providing a structure for smaller practices to go in together. Then, when the IPA has a set, they can go to the insurance companies and say, hey, you all are looking to set up a network. We've got a bunch of practices that we've already gotten organized. If you just contract with us, the IPA, then you can get a bunch of practices for your network here, one-stop shopping, and we'll handle the arrangements with the individual practices. The IPA would then go out and make an arrangement with the insurer that provides for the IPA physicians to be in network with the insurer and for the IPA to get paid by the insurer under agreed terms when enrollees use care from IPA doctors. And then, in turn, at a second step, the IPA will pay the physicians according to the terms that they've agreed with the physicians. One interesting thing to note here, and a source of confusion sometimes, is that individual practices can mix and match a bit when it comes to working with IPAs. A practice may, for example, work with one IPA for its arrangements with one insurer, but then go off and contract directly with a different insurer, or maybe they decide to go through a second IPA to work with a second insurer. There can be lots of different combinations out there, and if you encounter this, you sometimes just have to sit down and figure it out, and sometimes that takes some effort. The upshot of this is a couple things. First, it introduces this new entity into our picture of the healthcare system and into the mix that we have to keep track of. Sometimes the payments don't flow directly from the intermediary to the providers. They go through this other entity in the middle, like an IPA, and sometimes it's really important to keep track of that. The second thing to keep in mind is that this allows the payment arrangements to differ at the two levels. The contract that the intermediary makes with the IPA may have terms that are different than the contracts that the IPA makes with the individual practices. Those contracts don't have to be the same, and in fact, often they are not the same. So that's a lot. There's a fair amount of fluidity in here. These arrangements can get worked out a lot of different ways, but hopefully this gives us a better handle on how the arrangements between practices and intermediaries look, and we can build on that.